You might be familiar with the famous words in Matthew 5 that say, "Do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." This phrase, often referenced to the principle of lex talionis in Exodus 21:24, was actually intended to limit retribution and prevent harm to others. But does it also imply, as many think, that all forms of self-defense are totally unacceptable in the Bible? In essence, what does the Bible say about self-defense? This is a very troubling and thought-provoking question in Christendom. Before we dive into the true insights we can pull from the Bible here, we ask that you give the video a like, subscribe and turn on notifications, as it helps us spread enriching insights like these from the Bible. Taking a look at Exodus 22:2-3, which says, "If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed." Here we see a distinction between self-defense in the dark of night, where one might not know the thief's intentions, and during the day, where it might be possible to avoid lethal force. This passage suggests that defending one's home and family, especially under uncertain and threatening circumstances, is acceptable. Let's bring this into today's context. Imagine you're at home with your family, and someone breaks in. What do? According to biblical principles, you have the right to protect your loved ones. This might involve calling the police, securing your home and, if necessary, defending yourself against immediate threats. But it's also crucial to pray for wisdom and guidance in such situations, trusting that God is with you. Or consider a less dramatic situation, a heated argument with a neighbor. Instead of letting it escalate, would you apply Jesus' teaching of turning the other cheek? Would you seek to diffuse the situation with kindness and understanding, showing that you value peace over conflict? There's the story of Nehemiah, who led the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. In Nehemiah 4:17-18, we read about the workers carrying their tools in one hand and weapons in the other to protect themselves from their enemies. Nehemiah 4:14 even says, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes." This shows that while trusting in God, they also took practical steps to defend themselves and their community. Now, let's move to the New Testament. This is where things get a bit more challenging, especially with Jesus' teachings on love, peace, and non-violence. One of the most famous passages is Matthew 5:38-39, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Eye for eye and tooth for tooth.' But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." At first glance, this seems to reject any form of self-defense altogether, but it's important to understand the cultural context. A slap on the right cheek was a backhanded slap, considered more of an insult than a physical attack. Jesus is teaching us not to seek revenge for insults and to break the cycle of retaliation. However, does this mean we should never protect ourselves or others? Not necessarily. In Luke 22:36, during the Last Supper, Jesus tells his disciples, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." This seems to contradict his earlier teachings, but it shows the complexity of the situation. Jesus knew that his disciples would face dangerous times ahead, and being prepared for self-defense was part of their reality. There's another key passage in Romans 12:18-19, where Paul writes, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." Paul advocates for peace, but also acknowledges that there are limits to what we can control. While we should strive to live peacefully, there might be times when self-defense is necessary. You might recall the passage we mentioned earlier from Luke 22:36, where Jesus tells his disciples to buy a sword if they don't have one. This instruction came right before his arrest and crucifixion, a time when the disciples would face significant danger. While Jesus wasn't promoting violence, he was acknowledging the practical need for self-defense. He said to them, "But now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." The disciples said, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords." "That's enough," he replied. This shows Jesus preparing his disciples for the dangers ahead. While the exact purpose of the swords is debated, it's clear that Jesus acknowledged the need for some form of self-defense. Importantly, when Peter used the sword to defend Jesus during his arrest, Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Matthew 26:52. Jesus didn't outrightly rebuke Peter for having possession of a sword. He never chastised him. Instead, he barely cautioned him to sheath his sword. Consider also the context of the Old Testament. Warriors like David and Joshua, and even the average Israelite, were often armed for protection. The Bible doesn't explicitly commend Christians to bear arms, but it does show that being prepared to protect oneself and one's family is considered wise and prudent. In a modern context, this could translate to the right to own and responsibly use firearms for self-defense. However, it's essential to balance this right with the Christian principles of peace and love. Owning a weapon for protection should never be about seeking conflict, but about ensuring safety in dire situations. Now, let's talk about persecution. The early Christians often faced persecution, and many chose martyrdom over violent resistance. This is an important aspect of Christian history, where faithfulness to God was shown through non-violence, even at the cost of their own lives. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, forgave his attackers as they stoned him in Acts 7:60, following Jesus' example on the cross. Yet, not all situations call for passive acceptance. In Acts 16:37, Paul asserts his Roman citizenship to avoid unjust treatment, using legal means for self-protection. In Matthew 10:23, Jesus tells his disciples, "When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another." Jesus himself often avoided unnecessary danger. In John 8:59, when the crowd tried to stone him, he slipped away and avoided the attack. This shows that even Jesus chose to prevent danger when it wasn't his time to die. Jesus' teachings provide valuable guidance on how to respond to persecution. He advised his followers to flee from one city to another if they faced persecution. This isn't about running away out of fear, but about being wise and preserving oneself to further God's work. One of the most compulsive examples of this is found in Paul's life. Let's look at 2 very important instances from the book of Acts, where Paul faced imminent danger and chose to flee to continue his ministry. Shortly after his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, Paul began to preach boldly about Jesus in the synagogues. This stirred up a lot of anger among those who opposed the message of Christ. In Acts 9:20-25, we read, "After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall." Paul's escape in a basket was not an act of cowardice, but a strategic move to preserve his life so he could continue his mission. Later in his ministry, Paul again faced a deadly threat. In Acts 23:12-23, a group of more than 40 men took an oath to neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. When Paul's nephew heard of this conspiracy, he informed Paul and the Roman commander. The commander then arranged for 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to escort Paul safely to Governor Felix. But the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, so he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." This passage shows how God can use various means, including secular authorities, to protect his people. Paul's life was spared, allowing him to continue his work and ultimately spread the gospel to Rome. Many contemporary Christian figures practice their faith openly and courageously, often without any security detail, despite facing threats. This showcases their trust in God and their commitment to their mission. For instance, modern-day figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, during the Civil Rights Movement, publicly stood for justice and equality rooted in his Christian faith, often without significant personal protection. His courage in the face of threats was deeply inspiring. Similarly, in various parts of the world today, Christians continue to practice and preach their faith in hostile environments. Pastors, missionaries, and everyday believers in regions where Christianity is opposed often face threats and violence. Yet many choose to remain and spread the message of Christ, practicing the biblical principle of standing firm, while also being wise and taking measures to protect themselves when necessary. So, how do we reconcile the need for self-defense with our call to faith and peace? The key is understanding the difference between self-defense and violence. The Bible clearly distinguishes between self-defense and spreading the gospel through violent means. Christians are called to share the love of Christ peacefully and compassionately. Self-defense, however, is about protecting oneself and others from immediate harm, not about seeking revenge or instigating conflict. In Romans 12:18, Paul advises, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." So, while we should strive for peace, there are situations where self-defense becomes necessary. The gospel should never be spread by force, but protecting oneself against unjust aggression is permissible. The account of the disciples carrying swords signifies preparedness, not an endorsement of violence. When Jesus said, "That's enough," in response to the 2 swords, he showed the principle of sufficiency rather than surplus. This means being prepared for potential threats without embracing a violent lifestyle. By carrying swords, the disciples were ready to defend themselves if absolutely necessary, but they were not to use these weapons for aggressive purposes. This shows a balance between enduring persecution and standing up for one's rights. So, how do we balance the biblical call to love our enemies with the right to self-defense? Here are a few principles to consider. First and foremost, our trust should be in God's protection. Psalm 46:1 reminds us, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. While we take practical steps for safety, our ultimate trust is in Him. Whenever possible, we should strive for peace and reconciliation. This is a core Christian value that reflects Jesus' teachings. If it ever comes to a point where self-defense is necessary, it should be proportionate and aimed at stopping the threat, not seeking revenge. The goal is protection, not harm. We hope this video clarifies what the Bible says about self-defense. If you haven't already, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.